Tuia te rangi e tu nei, tuia te papa e takoto nei, tuia te mira tangata. Talofa, shalom, salam alaikum. Good morning everybody. I'm really delighted and honoured to be here. Thank you so much, Piri and Jessica, Scott, Ruth, and I know there are many others for organising this wonderful event and for including me in it. As some of you may know, I took up the post of Chief Commissioner recently, just earlier this year, and I feel proud and honoured to be appointed. And it's a huge pleasure for me to return to Aotearoa, where I spent happy years studying at Waikato University and then working at Waikato University and living in Hamilton, where my kids grew up. So it's good to be back. Friends, we have to refresh human rights for our times. And we have to refresh human rights for our place. So how do we refresh human rights for our times and for our place in Aotearoa? First, we have to call for all human rights. The civil and political rights, like freedom of religion. The employment rights, like the right to a decent wage. Cultural rights, like the right to enjoy our culture. And social rights, like the right to a decent home. All those rights are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which New Zealand helped to draft. But many of those rights have been airbrushed out of our national picture. And in my view, we must reclaim them all. In addition, we need to call for other human rights as well, those in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a declaration that's been affirmed by New Zealand. And also the right to a safe and healthy environment, which is now widely recognised. In New Zealand, some of these rights that I've mentioned, they are guaranteed in our laws, such as the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and that act is a colossal achievement. It's hugely important, but some of the rights that I've referred to, frankly, are just about invisible in New Zealand. And amongst those invisible, neglected rights are social rights, such as the right to a decent home. These are neglected rights for neglected people. So we have to refresh human rights for our times by calling for all human rights, including social rights, such as the right to a decent home. In addition, we have to refresh human rights by thinking of individuals and communities in the human rights context. Usually, some of you will know, human rights focus on individuals. Human rights are usually seen as a way of granting entitlements to individuals. Usually, human rights give little attention to the place of individuals within communities. But there are exceptions to that. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of their personality is possible. Everyone has duties to the community. So it's entirely legitimate, although rarely done, it's entirely legitimate to talk about human rights, individuals and communities. Usually human rights give scant attention to life-enhancing communities. And in my opinion, this is one reason why Te Reti o Waitangi and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are so extremely important and so extremely valuable. They drag human rights beyond the classic narrow focus on the individual, and the treaty and the declaration demand a wider focus on individuals and their communities. And so this is another way of refreshing human rights for our time and for our place by locating individuals within their communities. I want to briefly mention another way of refreshing human rights for our times and for our place. I speak as a lawyer. Lawyers have appropriated human rights. We have made human rights top-down, technocratic, legalistic, and judicial. But there's another approach to human rights. It's bottom-up, it's participatory. And this approach depends upon the participation of individuals and communities with a view to making human rights real in communities, iwi, workplaces, clinics, schools, universities, and housing strategies and programs. And this bottom-up participatory approach, it wrests human rights away from the lawyers and places them back where human rights belong, which is with individuals and communities. In truth, there's a role for both the legal, technocratic, top-down approach as well as the bottom-up participatory approach. And a blend of both approaches is another way of refreshing human rights for our times and for our place. Leilani referred to this. In the last 10 years or so, global human rights have taken a new direction. For years, human rights, international human rights, focused on declaring human rights. That is, drafting human rights treaties, conventions, declarations, and all that. And this declaratory work was and is extremely important. But in recent years, there's been a change. There's been a change of focus from declaring human rights to their real-life, practical, messy implementation in communities, in hospitals, in care homes, in workplaces, and in the housing sector. So we've crucially moved from this era of human rights declaration to the era of human rights implementation. And implementation requires human rights to be integrated into laws, regulations, institutions, policies, plans, practices, and processes. And implementation does not depend upon lawyers. It doesn't depend upon lawyers going to court. It depends upon policymakers and researchers and practitioners taking human rights seriously, and thereby avoiding ever to have to go to court. In my opinion, friends, it's unrealistic to expect Minister Twyford or anyone else in national government or local government to adopt the right to a decent home unless we first make it reasonably clear what this human right means. We knew there was a right to a decent home over a quarter of a century ago. There it was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and elsewhere. So we've known for decades that there is a right to a decent home, but very frankly, friends, very frankly, 25 years ago, nobody knew what the hell it meant. The right was there, boldly declared, in a tiny handful of words, and that was it. It was sort of lawmaking by bumper sticker. But that was 25 years ago. Since then, thanks to the work of multitudes around the world, we have a clearer picture of what the right to a decent home means. And some of this clarity is provided by more recent international human rights instruments that New Zealand has signed up to. These instruments help to point the way, but even they are not detailed. Thankfully, thank heavens, in addition to them, UN independent human rights experts have fleshed out in literally hundreds of authoritative reports what the right to a decent home means. Leilani, who we listened to just now, she's one of those eminent experts, and there are others. Also, over the last 25 years, across the world, civil society organizations have written countless briefings and reports on the right to a decent home. Civil society groups have literally demonstrated in the streets for the right to a decent home. Remember what Leilani said? She said, "Make some noise." Civil society organizations have remonstrated with officials to take seriously the right to a decent home. In some countries, national human rights institutions, like the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, have called for their governments to implement the right to a decent home. And this is what the Commission called for in its response to the Christchurch earthquakes. In some countries, governments have brought the right to a decent home into their national law, and governments have used it to shape housing policy. Crucially, there is evidence that human rights-shaped policies improve the lives of individuals and communities. Most recently, as Leilani mentioned, Canada has passed a National Housing Strategy Act which explicitly affirms the right to adequate housing, as it puts it, the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right. The Act continues, and I quote very briefly, "The Minister must develop and maintain a national housing strategy taking into account key principles of a human rights-based approach to housing." Moving on from Canada, in some countries where the law permits, lawyers have gone to court and argued for the right to a decent home. And in some of these cases, judges have recognized the right to a decent home. They've ordered its implementation, and the lives of individuals and communities have improved. And these days, there are scores of books on the right to a decent home. My point is that 25 years ago, the right to a decent home attracted just a handful of words. But today, across the world, there are so many reports, so many briefings, so many laws, cases, and books on the right to a decent home, it's difficult to keep up to date. But what about in Aotearoa? Where are the briefings? Where are the books? Where are the policies? Where are the cases on the right to a decent home in our islands? How many parliamentary debates mention the right to a decent home? How many parliamentary questions mention the right to a decent home? Where are the peaceful demonstrations calling for the right to a decent home? All credit to those who are already calling for the right to a decent home in Aotearoa. There are some, many of them in this room, and they deserve our enormous respect. But friends, they are honourable exceptions to the rule. In relation to the right to a decent home, New Zealand must join the 20th century. That's not a misstatement. I mean the 20th century. We must join the 20th century, which is when the right to a decent home first emerged. We must start explicitly and consistently naming and talking about the right to a decent home. If individuals, communities, iwi, civil society, academics do not consistently call for the right to a decent home, we can't expect Minister Twyford to take this human right seriously. If rights holders do not take the right to a decent home seriously, how can we expect duty bearers, that is government, to take the right seriously? Human rights embody a set of values. Values such as fairness, decency, dignity, well-being, and equality of all individuals and communities. Human rights are relational. They are also intergenerational. After all, there's an entire treaty devoted to the Convention on the Rights of Children. I'll leave others to reflect on the degree to which these human rights values and concepts resonate with Te Ao Māori. Informed by human rights values and concepts, human rights then go beyond those values and concepts. They take a further step. They indicate what needs to be done. For example, the right to a decent home requires a comprehensive, effective housing strategy that gives priority to those in most need. The strategy is required to engage all levels of government. As Leilani herself wrote in one of her most recent reports, and I quote, strategies should address the legacy of decolonisation and the systemic housing inequality and dispossession experienced by Indigenous peoples. The right to a decent home requires that there must be meaningful participation in the design, the implementation, and accountability of the strategy. The right to a decent home is much more than having an affordable house over your head. It's about having a home where you can live in safety, in peace, and in dignity. The right is about ensuring access for all. For example, modifications may be needed to meet a disabled person's specific needs. The right to a decent home entails security of tenure. It entails the availability of public services and facilities. I could go on, but this is a short summary of what the right to a decent home means in practice. Of course, the right to a decent home does not provide magic solutions to the really complex problems that we're struggling with these days. Human rights does not provide magic solutions because there are no magic solutions. But the right to a decent home is now more than that one-line bumper sticker. It's longer than a Donald Trump tweet. It has depth. It has detail. It can help chart the way forward. It can help to ensure key elements such as active and informed participation, key elements are not overlooked. And we know from history that key elements are often overlooked. The right to a decent home can dignify and empower individuals and communities. And let me just give you one short example. It's actually from Scotland. The Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Edinburgh Tenants Federation have been helping residents use the right to a decent home as a way of challenging deplorable housing conditions. So they focused on one particular housing estate on the outskirts of Edinburgh. For years, residents complained to the local council about vermin infestation, about mold, about dampness that was causing ill health. But little or nothing happened. With the help of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, the residents had a change of strategy. They began to frame their complaints as failures of human rights. They took it into their own hands. They devised their own indicators. They identified a baseline. They met with the council. They developed an action plan for the council. And they measured progress or lack of it over time. Council officers were provided with human rights training. They hadn't a clue what was going on. They were provided with human rights training. And there were notable improvements to the housing, to the accommodation. There were improvements, new kitchens, new bathrooms, new heating, new windows. But in a way, even more important than that, the residents reported increased skills and confidence. One of the tenants, a wonderful, wonderful woman, said this. She said, and it's a short 2 sentences, and it's gold. She said this: human rights pulls you together as a community and gives you the same goal. The fact that I know that I have a right to a wind-tight, watertight, mold-free house means I don't have to be scared. Friends, I have a suggestion, and I'd appreciate your critical comments on it. The New Zealand Human Rights Commission is preparing its forthcoming priorities, its forthcoming programme of action. We can't do everything. We have to be ruthlessly strategic and selective. One option is that we give attention to poverty. Poverty, as we all know, is a burning issue, a human rights issue in Aotearoa. And it implicates a wide range of human rights, including the right to a decent home. So in its forthcoming work, frankly, should the Human Rights Commission give attention to poverty? And if we give attention to poverty, should we include the right to a decent home? And if we include the right to a decent home, what work should we aim to do in relation to the right to a decent home? As I explained, New Zealand has signed up to the right to a decent home. The international declarations and conventions don't tell us a hell of a lot about what this human right means, but they do tell us something. And as I sought to explain, over the last 25 years, we now have a huge literature on the right to a decent home. From all this material, the general contours and content of the right to a decent home are crystallizing. When I say the general contours and content, I mean they're not specific to the unique context of Aotearoa. And here is my suggestion for very genuinely your critical comment. Should the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, through a working group which of course is respectful of Te Reti o Waitangi, should the working group identify what the right to a decent home means in the specific, unique context of Aotearoa? The working group would be inspired by the human rights values and concepts I've already signalled, and also the values and concepts Moana Jackson talked about yesterday in relation to home. Remember, he talked about mountains, dreams, the earth, and aroha. And the working group would draw from the values identified by the independent group on constitutional transformation, such as tikanga, community, and belonging, all of which mentioned by Moana yesterday. The working group could not lower the standards set by New Zealand's international human rights obligations. It would have to have respect to the contours and content set out by New Zealand's international human rights obligations. But within those boundaries, the working group could prepare a short document, not a great book, a short document, 10 sides, which outlines the minimum essential requirements of the right to a decent home in Aotearoa. The Commission has the statutory power to publish non-binding guidelines. So the Commission could publish guidelines on the right to a decent home in Aotearoa. And these guidelines could be used by national and local government, by others in the housing sector, to shape housing law, policies, and programs. The guidelines could be used by the Human Rights Commission, iwi, and civil society to hold government accountable for its obligations arising from the right to a decent home. So, in summary, would it be helpful if the Human Rights Commission establishes a treaty-based process to prepare a short document which it publishes as guidelines on the right to a decent home in Aotearoa? Please let me know. I have colleagues here. Please contact me. I have colleagues here. We can be contacted over the break and by email in due course. I now have to close. At the beginning of my remarks, I asked, how do we refresh human rights for our time and for our place? And here is one possible answer to that question. We refresh human rights for our time and our place by embracing all human rights, including the right to a decent home, by looking to individuals and communities, by looking to rights and duties, by legalistic top-down and participatory transformative bottom-up. We refresh human rights not just by more declaring, although that's important, but by practical, messy implementation. And we could make a start in the Commission by preparing guidelines on a right to a decent home in Aotearoa. Mori ki te rangi, ora ki te whenua, mori ora ki a tatou katoa. Kia ora, thank you.